I've been waiting to do this video for quite a long time. I've been using the Canon C300 Mark III for music videos, commercial work, our regular YouTube content, and now I can finally do a full in-depth review of the Canon C300 Mark III. And spoiler alert, the C300 might actually be my favorite camera out of all the cameras out right now. So let's start the review. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Picture. Before we start the actual review and you're new to this channel, let me give you a quick introduction of what I'm all about and what I'm using this camera for. I am a professional filmmaker that does commercial work as well as a lot of YouTube content. Our specialty lies in corporate work as well as music videos and a lot of athlete profiles. So this is basically what I'm using this camera for, as well as basically all the YouTube content you can imagine, like interview setups, talking heads, B-roll of some products, as well as fashion and model shoots. So overall, most of the stuff that I'm shooting is handheld, it's run and gun, and it needs to be quick and also very versatile. And the C300 Mark III really fits that niche. And I've also been using the C500 Mark II, and I will also do a review on this next week, as well as a comparison between the two. So if you haven't already, consider subscribing right now if you're interested in that content as well. But now, without any further ado, let's start the review. And the first point on our list is, as always, the design and build quality of the camera. When it comes to the overall design and form factor of the Canon C300 Mark III, I think it's almost perfect. I like the form factor a lot, and coming from the C200, I had some things that bothered me, and I feel like they fixed this on the C300 Mark III. I really love that you don't have the viewfinder anymore, which makes the whole camera even more compact and way better for gimbal use. Another thing I really like about the new design is that it's so modular, and you can use it on a big production set and rig it out with V-mount batteries and lots of accessories. But if you want to use it as a small handheld run and gun machine, the way that I do it most of the times, you also have that option, and it fits quite perfectly for that kind of use case. The camera comes with a side grip from Canon, and I really like that side grip because it does have buttons like record options, and it also has some custom buttons that I really appreciate because it makes for handheld shooting a lot easier. In addition to the side handle, it also comes with a top handle and a monitor mount, and I don't use any of those because I'm not using the original monitor, and I'm always using a third-party monitor anyway. Right now I'm using the OCG7 that I just did a review on because I think the original monitor is just too small and not bright enough, especially if you're focusing manually. As I like to keep it very simple, I just use a small rig top handle that is attached directly to the camera via a small rig Nato rail, so that I can easily take it off whenever I need to put the camera on a gimbal, for example. The monitor is attached via a small rig monitor mount directly to the top handle, and that works perfectly well for my kind of shooting. I really like the button layout of the Canon C300 Mark III because you have lots of buttons and you can quickly access all the settings that you need and make changes to it whenever you're running and gunning. And now that all the buttons are illuminated, it makes for an even quicker shooting on set. One thing I do wish for the camera to have were some actually customizable buttons, because all the buttons that you have on a Canon C300 Mark III are already assigned to a specific function. Granted, I don't need all of these. For example, I don't ever use zebras, so I remapped this to false color, for example, and you can customize all of the buttons. But it does trigger my OCD sometimes when I'm pressing a button that says zebras and it actually pops up some waveforms, but that might just be my problem. But overall, I would have liked for Canon to implement maybe one or two buttons that are just basically there to customize yourself. As I've already said, I think that the design is almost perfect. And when I say almost, I think that the battery compartment is something that annoys me a little, because even the smaller BPA30 batteries stick out in the back. Not to mention that the A60 batteries stick out a whole lot. And that makes handheld shooting, when pressing it to your chest, which I do a lot when shooting to get more stability, kind of a pain, because the back of the camera now isn't plain anymore. Another small design change that I would wish for is that you had the option to actually put a cold shoe somewhere on the top or the side of the camera. Because as it stands right now, when I'm using my top handle, there isn't really an option to mount any kind of microphone, either XLR or just 3.5mm headphone jack onto the camera without it being in the way of my top handle. The last thing I wish for them to have is some kind of power out that I could power my external monitor with it without having to have a V-mount battery or the entire extension unit. But that's pretty much all the little problems that I have with the design, and other than that, I think the design is amazing. Oh wait, maybe there's one more thing that I really dislike about the design of the camera, and that is that it only has an EF mount instead of an RF mount, because we already started investing into RF lenses and now we can't use them on the Canon C300 Mark III. Yes, I know there's rumors out there that Canon is actually going to come out with an RF cinema camera, but well, I already bought the C300 Mark III, so now it's actually me getting rid of RF lenses instead of just changing out to a new cinema camera anytime soon. Next up, let's talk about the recording options that the C300 Mark III has, and there's good and there's bad, because I really do like the recording options on the Canon C300 Mark III. It records Canon RAW Light with 1 gigabit per second in 25 frames, 50 frames, and also up to 125 frames in Canon RAW Light. I do like the simplicity of every shooting mode having the same data bitrate, so I don't really have to choose between higher storage needs if I'm changing between any kind of shooting modes. But that's obviously not only a good thing, because I would love for them to implement some kind of compression rates like Blackmagic or Red Dust, so I can actually choose the compression rate and also the storage needs depending on what kind of projects I'm shooting for. Another thing some people complain about is that when shooting in 24 or 25 frames you get 12-bit, but when shooting in 50 frames or higher you only get 10-bit. Me personally, I never had a problem with that, and I've been mixing 25 and 50 frame footage as long as I had the C200 years ago, and I never had a problem with it. I could actually never even tell a difference. You also have the option to shoot up to 180 frames when cropping down to a Super 16 mode, which is actually kind of usable, but I will talk about this in the image quality section later. The only other codec you can shoot internally other than RAW is XFAVC, and although the XFAVC codec holds up very well to the RAW, I don't really see a lot of benefit of me shooting with it because the bitrates are so similar to the RAW files. A lot of the content I shoot is in 50 frames or higher, so when shooting XFAVC you are looking at a data rate of 810 Mbits per second, but in RAW you're having 1 gigabit per second, so there isn't really too much of a difference for me to not shoot RAW, because the RAW is definitely better than the XFAVC. At least on my computer I can't really see any difference when it comes to editing the XFAVC to the Canon RAW Lite, because both perform pretty much the same, so even that isn't really a benefit of the XFAVC for me. Pretty much the only other benefit that I've seen of using the XFAVC compared to the RAW is that you have the ability to shoot with the digital image stabilization. In my tests, the digital image stabilization actually works pretty well in most cases, but it's also only being used for a really certain amount, and that is basically just getting rid of shakes when you're just walking around. And I myself pride myself of actually being very stable handheld even when walking, so I don't really see that much of a benefit in the digital image stabilization. But I did have some situations where it actually completely messed up my shot when I was moving in and out of some kind of situation, because it started this really wobbling feeling, especially when you have a subject that is moving but you're not moving yourself. Then the image stabilization starts doing some funky stuff and starting to image stabilize something that isn't really there. So for me personally, I wouldn't ever use the digital image stabilization for the work that I do, but for you that might be different. And keep in mind, it's only available when shooting XFAVC and you don't have access to it when shooting RAW. To sum it up, I would love to have other shooting options like ProRes or different compression rates, but as it stands right now, 1 gigabit per second in Canon RAW Light is actually pretty good for what I do, and it's right at the edge of where I think it's not overkill and the data rate and storage needs are actually reasonable. Next, let's talk about the autofocus, and I think we should dedicate an entire section just to the autofocus alone, because I think that this feature is something that distinguishes the Canon C300 and C500 Mark II from a lot of other cinema cameras and is actually a big selling point for a lot of people out there. So overall, yes, the autofocus is amazing, especially considering that this is a full-fledged cinema camera and you can actually use it a lot. And I've been using the autofocus a lot on the Canon C300, and Canon claims that the autofocus on the Canon C300 Mark III has even gotten a lot better. I do have some issues with the autofocus though, and that comes down to my kind of style of shooting, because I like shooting backlit, either in sunset or sunrise. And when you present the camera with such a challenging environment, the autofocus really isn't up to the task, and when I was using it, it couldn't find my subject's face most of the time, or it started focus hunting a lot. So in that kind of situation, I need to focus manually anyway, so I don't really have a lot of benefit of the autofocus. Another thing that always bothered me about pretty much every Canon camera that I've used is the tracking, because it is there, but me personally, I have never been able to make this work for me. Even when I have just a subject walking around slowly and I want to track it, as soon as I start tracking it, it loses my subject after 2 seconds. And we're shooting a lot of sports and athletes, and this feature would be amazing if we could actually use this to track an athlete like a figure skater on the ice or a runner or someone doing fitness. But for some reason it just doesn't work for me, and the camera always loses focus after about 2 seconds. So this is a feature of the autofocus that at least I wasn't able to make work for me. Another really big problem that I have with the autofocus is the different options of the autofocusing field. Obviously, you have the face detection that I'm using right now, and this works really well in most cases. And then you have the option between a small autofocus field and a large autofocus field. The problem with the large autofocus field is that it really isn't large at all. And that comes immediately apparent when shooting something of a little bit more action. So for example, if you're shooting a dancer or a model or an athlete that is moving from left to right, and the small focusing field isn't really on your subject at all times, the camera typically loses focus and tries to focus on something else in the background. Yes, of course, I can decrease the autofocus responsiveness, but that obviously starts biting me in the butt when I'm moving in and out, and now the camera is really slow getting to the autofocus point that I'm looking for. So here I would love to have more options like on a Canon EOS R with larger focus fields, different kind of shapes, or even a complete automatic one where the camera tries to just find whatever they think should be in focus, because on an EOS R that actually works pretty well. But overall, the autofocus of the camera is amazing, especially the face detection, where you can set the camera to only focus on faces, is amazing when shooting interviews or even talking heads like this, because the camera doesn't lose focus and tries to focus hunt or focus on the background whenever it loses a face. So that is something that I highly appreciate in the Canon C300 Mark III. Let's talk a little bit about battery life. Coming from a Canon C200, you drastically see a difference on a Canon C300 Mark III, because now the battery life is pretty much cut in half. A BP-A30 used to last me about 2 hours on a Canon C200, and now it's around 1 hour. Same goes for the BP-A60, where basically if you had 2 of those on a Canon C200, you could basically shoot all day without ever having to power off the camera, and now a BP-A60 only lasts you about 2 hours, maybe a little bit more than that. So now you can definitely see that the Canon C300 is a lot more power hungry than the Canon C200 was. Overall, the battery life is still amazing, and with my kind of shooting, I can shoot an entire music video on one BP-A60 alone and still have battery life left. So as of right now, I only have one BP-A60 and one BP-A30 for gimbal work, and I have never had a problem with getting through an entire day of shooting with only 2 batteries. But if you do want more juice, you can hook up a V-mount solution via the original Canon extender plate, or there's also different kind of third-party V-mount plates that nicely fit on the back of your Canon C300. So if you do need a lot more power, then this is a great option for you as well. One thing I don't like is that they didn't include an AC charger for your Canon C300 like they did on the Canon C200, because this is something that I have used a lot for interview setups in the past. Luckily for me, I have so many lights, and one of those actually has the XLR power adapter that works perfectly with the Canon C300. But if you did want to buy one and you don't have one included, then they would charge you up to, I think, $300, which I think is a lot of money for just having to power your camera continuously. So before we talk about the overall image quality, the slow motion capabilities and the dynamic range of the camera, let's hear it from our sponsor. And today's sponsor is our own online store, where we have custom made LUT packs for different kind of camera brands and different kind of specific cameras. And all our footage that you've seen here from all our Canon cameras is basically graded with our own custom Canon LUT packs. And we also have different kind of production contracts and waivers on our online store that you can customize yourself and use for all of your client work and productions to never have any misunderstandings with your clients in the future. So go check them out, the link is in the description below. But now, after all of that, let's talk about the image quality. In the very beginning, I was a little bit skeptical on spending so much money on a camera that, in quotes, only shoots 4K, because now all these new cameras come out and shoot 6K, and even our $2,000 Pocket 6K shoots 6K. So I was a little skeptical when investing so much money into the Canon C300 Mark III. But looking at the image, it actually looks amazing, and the 4K out of it is much better than the ones on the Canon C200, which I thought was always a little bit soft. And I'm even going a step further, because I've been using the Canon C500 Mark II as well, which does have a full frame 6K sensor. But in most instances, I can't really see a difference between the 4K of the Canon C300 and the 6K of the Canon C500, especially when uploading it to YouTube with YouTube's compression, and that is pretty much everything we do. You can't really tell the difference. That would be worth spending so much more money. So overall, when it comes to the sharpness and the overall detail of the image, I am really satisfied with what the Canon C300 has to offer. Whenever people talk about Canon, they talk about Canon's color science. And yes, it's true, it is amazing and it's so easy to grade. For example, this talking head is all shot in RAW. I used C-Log 2 for the most dynamic range, and then I just used a conversion LUT from Canon to get it into a Rec. 709 space. The last thing I needed to do was just put a slight custom LUT on top of it from our cinema camera LUT pack to just give the colors a little bit more pop, and that's as easy as it gets. And this is something I really appreciate in Canon cameras as well as the C300 Mark III when you do a lot of YouTube content and fast turnaround projects, that you don't have to spend too much time on color grading, because the image out of the camera is already amazing. Next thing is the dynamic range, and that is one feature that is almost the most important on a camera for me, because nobody is talking about the dynamic range when it comes to your cinematic image, and most people are talking about frame rates, resolutions and color science. But I think that a good dynamic range can make or break an image when it comes to looking cinematic. And here the C300 Mark III shines. It's probably the camera with the most dynamic range that I have ever used, and that became apparent on different kind of shoots. For example, we were shooting a music video and our talent was sitting in the shade, whereas the midday sun was actually hitting the back wall, and still the latitude between her and the back wall was amazing, and I didn't have any blown out highlights in the back, and I still had all the details in the shadows of my talent in the foreground. So whichever scenario I have used the Canon C300 Mark III in, it's simply amazing when it comes to dynamic range, and it gives the whole image such a great, and yes, I know, quote unquote cinematic look, and it's also so forgiving when you're not shooting in the best and well lit scenarios, or if you can't control the lighting yourself. And for my style of shooting, this is something that is really important for me. I also did some overexposure tests where I tried to recover the highlights after exposing 2 stops, 4 stops and 6 stops over, and this is where Canon RAW doesn't really shine because it doesn't really have the full capabilities of something like Red RAW, for example, because the ISO is kind of baked in already. However, I was still able to recover most of the highlights even when shooting 4 stops over, but obviously when shooting 6 stops over, all the highlights were completely blown out and all the information was gone. But when shooting up to 2 to 3 stops overexposed on accident, you are able to recover most of them easily in post. So the dynamic range on this camera and the forgivingness of actually making mistakes on set are very high with the Canon C300 Mark III. Another big topic of the image quality section is the low light capabilities, and this is also a point that is very important for me as a filmmaker, as I do a lot of running gunning and I don't always have full control of the lighting of my scene. And I also like to shoot in low light, so having a DGO sensor that in theory is capable of shooting at high ISO values without introducing a lot of noise, even when shooting in RAW, is something that is really important for me as a filmmaker. And this is also where the Canon C300 and its DGO sensor shines, and I had no problem using all my low light footage without even having to use noise reduction, because the noise level of the Canon C300 is very nice and totally usable up to high ISO values. And even if you do get a noise floor at higher ISOs, I think the noise floor of the Canon C300 is actually pretty nice to look at because it looks more like film grain and it doesn't introduce a lot of color noise, which is something that I appreciate a lot. And the last thing on our list when it comes to image quality is the slow motion capabilities. And that was one point that was very important for me when purchasing a new camera in 2020, because I wanted to have a camera capable of at least 4K 100 frames without any kind of sensor cropping at a really nice image quality, and the Canon C300 Mark III delivers. It shoots 4K at 120 frames in cinema raw light with autofocus at the full sensor readout. It doesn't record audio and you don't have face detection autofocus, but other than that there's no limitations. And the image quality looks gorgeous. I could not see a difference between using 120 frames, 60 frames, or even 24 frames in most of my settings. And that is really one thing that I like about the Canon C300 Mark III. Because now you can seamlessly integrate the 120 frames into any kind of project without it becoming apparent that this is shot at a lower quality, as most of other cameras do these days. You can also shoot up to 180 frames on the Canon C300 Mark III when going into a cropped Super 16 mode. And yes, you definitely see a difference in quality when shooting at 180 frames, because you do introduce a little bit of moire and more noise because the sensor is cropped. But I still think with good lighting situations, if you really need that high of a frame rate, it's totally usable with a little bit of noise reduction in post. But if you don't have to use the 180 frames, I would stick with 120 frames for most part, because there's hardly any difference between that and all the other shooting frame rates in the Canon C300. Now that we've talked about all this, let's talk about the overall usability of the camera. And this is also something where Canon typically shines. And I have never had a problem with Canon menus, and I always loved them up until the point where I used Blackmagic, because I think Blackmagic does such a great job when it comes to having a camera menu that is completely intuitive and easy to use. That doesn't mean that Canon's menus aren't great. And basically with all the buttons on your camera, you don't really need to go into the menu most of the times, and that is something that is really cool on run and gun shooting. And like I've already mentioned, all the customizable buttons, the side grip, and all the other features that you have in your camera, the really low startup time, as well as the now improved media options where you can play back all your files in camera by just pressing the media button, and the camera doesn't have to turn off and on again like on the C200, but you can now immediately display all your clips in real time on your Canon C300 Mark III, is another improvement to the overall usability of the Canon C300, and one thing that, again, in my style of filmmaking is something that is worth so much to me. Wait, one more thing. I know this review is already long enough, but when it comes to the usability, there's actually one thing that I really dislike about the Canon C300 Mark III, and that is its focus peaking. As I've already mentioned, I do a lot of manually focusing, and when I do manual focusing, I actually like to use focus peaking to actually make my life easier. And on a Canon C300 Mark III, it just doesn't really work for me, because either it is way too low and you can't really see anything, especially when you're trying to focus on faces. For some reason it just doesn't show up the way I want it to. And the next thing that really bothers me is that the frequency is just way too high. So when you do focus peaking, basically your entire screen is red, and that is really annoying, and it's just not really enjoyable to shoot with. And yes, I did play around with the settings. I tried lowering the frequency as well as the gain, but it's either you can't see anything or your entire screen is dipped in red. And that is one thing that I don't like, so I'm actually using the focus peaking of my external monitor the entire time, and looking at the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, which has an amazing focus peaking right in the camera itself. This is a bummer, and I wish that they would improve on the internal focus peaking of the Canon C300 Mark III. And now actually to the verdict. So overall, what is my verdict of the Canon C300 Mark III? I think you already guessed it. We did purchase the Canon C300 Mark III, and I'm filming on my own production model right now, and I really love this camera because it checks pretty much all the boxes for me. It has high frame rates up to 120 frames in 4K at an amazing quality. It has great dynamic range. It has a totally usable autofocus when mounting it to a gimbal, and its form factor is also nice for run and gunning, but you can also rig it out or throw it on a gimbal. I will also do a review on the Canon 3S that I used with the Canon C300 in a couple of weeks from now, and I did have some issues with it because it didn't really 100% work the way I wanted to, so I need to do some more testing. But in theory, this camera is a great gimbal camera opposed to other cameras in the same category because of its small and compact design and the ability to have autofocus to be used on a gimbal. So overall, this camera is perfect for my kind of use case because it's so versatile. As a professional filmmaker who shoots a lot of corporate as well as athlete videos or music videos, as well as do a lot of YouTube content, talking head style, also product b-rolls, this camera is so amazingly versatile. And with its small and compact design for what it can do, it's also great to throw on a gimbal. And I will also do a gimbal review with the Canon C300 and the Canon C500 Mark II in the future. So again, subscribe if you haven't already. And I hope you liked this in-depth review of the Canon C300 Mark III. And if you did, I would love to see you on the next one.